out today, so I'm assuming most of you have not read this yet. You are in for a treat. You're in for a treat tonight when he's talking about it, but when you read this, I mean, it's just such an extraordinary gathering of traditional folk tales, but then also personal anecdotes and stories of his. Some of the ones that I found the most moving were stories of his father and stories of his family. It's really powerful. Julian and I have read it back and forth to one another out loud. It's an amazing thing. Damon was born in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and raised in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. A graduate of the University of South Carolina and the College of Charleston, where he received his master's. He's the author of 5 books, a public lecturer. This sounds much more official, doesn't it? Tour guide with Tour Charleston and Buxton Books, a storyteller, an adjunct professor of history at the Citadel. He has lectured in America, Canada, and West Africa, and has worked for numerous foreign and domestic media outlets. That's his official bio. I just think he's one of the most extraordinary humans that I have the privilege of knowing, and I am grateful that he works with us and is writing these books. And this is feels very official with this new thing. Can you hear well in the back? Oh, good. This is a brand new microphone for the bookstore, and there's no crackle as of right now, so that feels like a little miracle in itself, but it's probably just technology. Welcome, 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 and ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Professor Damon Fordham.
Okay, let me get this back up and adjust it here. All right, so let us begin. Most of you know that Michael rowed the boat ashore, and there's a reason why I just did that. You see, back in 1867, down in Port Royal, there were these musicologists, one of them by the name of Charles Well, who came down and they transcribed the songs of African Americans that were commonly known through history as the Negro spirituals. And many people know that that song was not necessarily about a guy named Michael rowing a boat ashore. It was basically sung in code regarding their desires to leave these plantations and be free. During the American Revolution, the British would have ships that would take African Americans to fight for the British, because the British promised black people freedom when they fought with them during the American Revolution, and that's what led George Washington to eventually allow black troops into the American Revolutionary Army. So what does this have to do with storytelling? Very simple. Most people are aware of the role of song in African American history. And by the way, Erica, there's a seat up here if you want to come on up and sit down, okay? You know, I don't want you to be uncomfortable. There you go, there you go. There you go, Erica. Thank you very much. See, now that you're comfortable, I feel better, okay? You're an honored guest of mine. So anyway, having said all of that, and now that Erica is comfortable, I'll continue. So anyway, chivalry is not dead, folks. No. But anyway, very few people have discussed the role of folk tales in as far as getting out the story of African Americans who were often denied a voice because of enforced illiteracy that was designed to keep them in slavery, okay? So, but in spite of the enforced literacy, in spite of being in some cases societies that were without the written word, it was not just the song, it was not just the dance, all those things are important, it was also the folk tale that got them through hard times. Now, before I get into how all that started, let me tell you how I got into this book. You see, I grew up surrounded by adults who were old enough to be my grandparents. In fact, my parents were old enough to be my grandparents. So they were of that last generation of elders who sat on front porches and regaled people with stories that used life lessons and stories about the family history and so forth. By and large, that tradition died out in the 60s and 70s with the advent of television, as well as a feeling among many young people that, man, I don't want to hear that old-time slavery stuff and all that. It sounds like something new and so on and so forth. So the generation who told those things largely died out by the time of the early 80s. But luckily, there were a few kids here and there, like me, who listened and loved to listen. Then, fast forward to 1977, and I'm 13 years old, and I'm this bookish weirdo who's very bad at sports, so I read a whole lot, right? And I was in the Mount Pleasant Library, which is now known as the Village Library, over on Wilden Street, and came across a book called Mules and Men by Zora Neale Hurston. Now, for those of you who don't know, Zora Neale Hurston was the great folklorist who, in 1935, she went back down to her hometown of Eatonville, Florida, and wrote down the stories of her elders on Joe Clark's front porch down in Eatonville. Not to be confused with the principal, by the way, another Joe Clark. So, I read that book and I said, wait a minute. These are some of the same stories that I grew up hearing my parents and other elders tell. And one of them was about go preach and go plow. And let me tell you how that went. The story goes that during slavery, these two guys were out there in the cotton fields picking cotton, and one of them said, boy, the sun is so hot. I wish I had something else to do. And he looked up in the sky, and lo and behold, the letters GPC were up in the sky. And so he said, hallelujah, praise the Lord, and started jumping around the cotton field. Another fellow was picking cotton and said, what's the matter with you? He said, Lord, it's time for me to get out of this cotton field. How so? Look up there in the sky. There's these letters GPC. It says, go preach Christ. So I'm out of this cotton field. I'm a free man. Hallelujah. And so the other guy who was listening to this was an old elder, wise old elder. He looked up in the sky and saw that GPC, and he said, fool, that don't say go preach Christ. That says go pick cotton. There's a seat up front here. Come on up. So I read that story in Zora Neale Hurston's Mules and Men, and my mother was very fond of that story. And it occurred to me, there's something about these stories that I've been taking for granted that is really, there's really something that's not just something that I should take for granted, like the air that I breathe and the water that I drink. These are something special. So I went around that summer telling these stories on people's porches. And that was kind of my foundation of public speaking and public life. And so I was always pretty much into that. So to fast forward a little bit more, after my first couple of books, for years I had jotted down whenever I talked to elders, I had written down their stories after I finished talking to them. Or whenever I was doing a research project and I came across some folklore, I'd save it for a separate notebook. So in 2009, I seriously considered writing a book called Folktales and Slave Stories that included all of this sort of thing. But then I figured, who else would want to read this other than scholars? Because there was no big folklore boom at the time. And unlike a lot of academics, I'm not really interested in just writing things for other academics to read. I write for the general public. So in 2018, my good friend, a man who I'm honored to say is my good friend and mentor, Dr. Henry Louis Gates, he wrote a book called The Annotated African American Folktales. And it sold pretty well. And I said, hey, I can do something with this manuscript. So, but I didn't want Skip to think I was, yes, he lets me call him Skip. And I didn't want him to think I was a copycat, so I emailed him and I said, well, look, you know, I'm really glad you have all this book and everything. In fact, he signed it for me. But I've got this South Carolina folklore that I think people might find interesting. And so he says, man, go ahead and do it. You know, it's you have my blessings with that. And so I proceeded. Now, 2022 and 2023, I made 2 trips to Senegal and Gambia and Togo. And in November, a few months ago, I was in Ghana, right? And when I was in Senegal, I just found some really amazing things. Among them was a guy at the West African Cultural Center named Dr. Ousmane Sene. And he was giving us a lecture, and he told us how in the Wolof tribe, in their culture, they tell the children the stories about Luk and Boki. And he explained as follows. You see, in Africa, you have what's called the griots, the storytellers. And the griots are the sort that, among children and adults, they gather them around and give them life lessons and history, as well as history through folk tales, right? So he told us about how Boki was this greedy hyena, ignorant but strong, whereas Luk was this short rabbit who was weak but wise. And they told the children to always be like Luk, whose biggest weapon that he had was in his head and not in his hands. And so I'm thinking, wait a minute, hold. This sounds like the Brer Rabbit stories they used to tell in this country over a century ago. And so he said, well, where do you think that came from? And sure enough, he was right. Why? Because in my research, I found out about a lady named Abby Christensen. She was a white lady that went down to Port Royal back in 1874 as a house guest of a man named Nathaniel Hayward. Yes, he's kin to the Haywards up in this area. And Nathaniel Hayward and Miss Christensen were out on the porch having a pleasant conversation. And Mr. Hayward goes, Abby, you want some entertainment? He said, sure. So he says, Prince, come on up here. Prince Basket, one of his field hands, who worked for him since slavery, came up and said, yes, sir. He goes, Prince, why don't you tell Miss Christensen one of those stories? So he said, yes, sir. And he told him about the wolf who wanted to have rabbit stew for dinner that night, but the rabbit had kept eating up his peanuts. And so he said, okay, I'll fix them. And he took a lump of tar and made this baby made out of tar and put a cap for her nose and button for her eyes and a hat on him and a pipe in his mouth and said, that'll fix that rabbit. So Brer Rabbit, short for brother, came hopping by and he said, oh, how you doing there, stranger? And started to shake hands with the tar baby, but the tar caught him and went, But so Wolf goes, aha, I got you now. And so he says, well, whatever you do, before you cut my head off and put me in the pot, please don't throw me in that briar patch. Don't throw you in the briar patch? That's right. You might boil me in the hot water and skin me alive. But please don't throw me in that briar patch. Don't throw you in there, huh? Well, I'll fix you. 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready, and hey, Mr. Book, you forgot something. Yeah, what's that? Number 1, I was born and raised in the briar patch. Number 2, you don't have no rabbit stew for the night. Ah! So Abby Holmes Christensen said, Prince, that's a very good story. Where did you get that from? And you know what Prince Baskin said? From my African granddaddy. So when I thought about what Mr. Ousmane Sene told me in Dakar and Senegal, West Africa, and I read that, that's how this connects. So Abby Holmes Christensen wrote the short story, The Rabbit, the Wolf, and the Tar Baby. And not too long after that in Georgia, Joel Chandler Harris heard a similar story from a man named, his name just flew out of my head just now. Uncle George Terrell. He called him Uncle George Terrell. But his real name was just George Terrell. Had told him that story during slavery. And so this is how America got into the whole thing with the Brer Rabbit stories. But there were other Brer Rabbit stories that were not widely known that continued to be used as folklore for years. Now, Abby Holmes Christensen wrote that story down and several other bits of African-American folklore in a book called Afro-American Folk Tales Told Around the Campfire in 1892. But there was also a lady named Elsie Clues who went down to Port Royal in 1919 and wrote and collected a bunch of these tales, including the following Brer Rabbit story. Said that one day Brer Rabbit had stolen food from all the other animals. And so the animals had a trial. And they determined that because Brer Rabbit was such a thief, that he would hang at dawn. So they put the rabbit in jail. And the rabbit was like, oh no, what's going to happen now? They're going to hang me tomorrow. And yes, it was his buddy the crane. And he said, hey, Brother Crane, how you doing? Well, Brer Rabbit, I'm real sorry that they're going to hang you in the morning. He goes, wait a minute. Thanks to you, they might not. Really? How's that? Come here, Brother Crane. So the next morning, the crowd gathered around the scaffold. And the animals started chanting, hang Brer Rabbit! Hang Brer Rabbit! Hang Brer Rabbit! And so they let him out of the jail cell with his handcuffs, and they started cheering, expecting to see a hanging, right? And so the hangman put the noose on Brer Rabbit, and the crowd was going, hang Brer Rabbit! Hang Brer Rabbit! Hang Brer Rabbit! And all of a sudden, lo and behold, a voice came up from on high. That rabbit ain't done nothing. Let that rabbit go. And the animal's like, ah! And start running off in every direction. And right after this, the crane flew from behind the cloud and flew down on the scaffold, and Brer Rabbit said, good job, Brother Crane. And they shook hands. Now, here's something to think about with that story. Now, Elsie Clues got that story from a 60-somewhat-year-old black lady named Maria Middleton over in Port Royal. Now, Maria Middleton was born in slavery, couldn't read or write, but yet they had the cleverness, because you know what was happening with a lot of African Americans in 1919, right? Hangings, lynchings. And so this is, in a sense, a form of a protest story when you stop and think about it, of an example of somebody using their brain to get out of one of the most dangerous things an African American can face at that time, which is hanging. So I thought that was a really interesting allegory, and so that was why I put that in the book. And there are several others that are somewhat similar to this. One of them goes as follows, about the fox and the cat. Then see, the beauty about this is it goes to show you that these are not just children's tales to entertain. They're also to make adults think. Said that the fox said that he had many tricks to help himself in time of trouble. So the cat said he only had but one trick. So shortly after they discussed the matter, they saw the dog coming. The cat ran up the tree, and the dog barked and barked at her, but he couldn't catch her. The fox tried all 10 of his tricks, but after all these tricks, the dog still caught twice. And so the moral of the story is the cat said, you know what, brother dog? He said, what's that? And as the fox was carrying the dog away, he said, one good trick is better than 10 that don't work. Thank you. And one of the best that was captured from that particular field trip where they got these stories was the one called The Man and Liquor. It was called about the cat and the rat. And there was a barrel of whiskey. And the rat fed head over heels inside the barrel of whiskey. So the rat said, oh, Lord, I wish somebody would come here and help me get out of my trouble. And so happened the cat came by, and the rat said to the cat, oh, brother cat, help. Look here a minute. And he said, Brother Cat, can you do me a favor? He said, sure, what's that? He said, can you help me out of this barrel of whiskey, and you can put me on the grass and let me dry? And and so the cat said, okay, now if I do that, what's in it for me? Well, if you take me out to dry and all of that, you're free to eat me up as much as you want. Oh, well, I haven't had a good fat mouse all day, so yeah, sure. So the cat pulled the rat out of the vat of liquor, dried him off and everything. And so while the rat was drying the sun, the cat stopped and put a handkerchief around his neck, got a nice knife and everything, all ready to go. And then all of a sudden the rat started running off. And the cat said, hey, what's the matter with you? This isn't part of the bargain. And the rat said, brother cat, don't you know that whenever a man's in liquor, he's going to say any old thing to come about? So this is how they both educated and entertained. Books were largely forbidden for them, but yet they had the creativity to make up stories like this. And it turns out that there were many others like this that were just buried in archives that are unread by most people today. Now, I just told you about Elsie Clues. She did this book full of folk tales from the South Carolina Sea Islands. It came out in 1923. Well, in 1936, you had, of course, the WPA Slave Narratives Project. This is where they interviewed the elderly ex-slaves about their experiences. And one really interesting fellow who they interviewed is a man whose picture is on this side of the book here. His name was Elijah Green, and he's one of my heroes. He talks about such things as how his slave owner was such a coward that he lived over on Queen Street, that when they tried to have the draft of the Confederacy, the slave owner ran up into the attic, and he had to go and so Elijah had to tell him that he wasn't home, and things like that. Well, it turns out that in the 40s, late 30s and early 40s, Elijah was the go-to guy for stories about slavery in Charleston. There's an interview of him in the Charleston News and Courier in 1940 where he's telling them the stories, and he told them about how he was the guy who buried John C. Calhoun. And he went into detail about how they buried him across from the St. Philip's Church over on Church Street, which is now Church Street and all of that. But when he told them that, he was interviewed earlier by a black man named Augustus Ladson, who went to Mother Emanuel. And when he told Augustus Ladson about how he buried John C. Calhoun, he added this to Augustus Ladson. He said, "By the way, I never liked old Calhoun because of how he felt toward the Negro people, and you never saw such a man who was so hated by the colored people." Now, think about this. He told this to the black person who interviewed him, but he didn't tell this to the Charleston News and Courier. Why is that? It goes to show you the divide at that time and how Elijah Green was born in slavery, and he knew that if he told that to the News and Courier in 1940, what would happen to him? Hello. But yet, in 1942, the Charleston branch of the YWCA invited Elijah Green over on Cumming Street to tell his stories about slavery to a generation who never knew it, and that was 3 years before he died in his home in 1945 at the age of 103. So I have that and a number of his stories in there, in this book. And I owe part of that to Josephine Humphreys, the local writer. She told me that there were a number of newspaper stories about Elijah Green, so I acknowledge that in putting them in as well as in this book. So let's look at some others. Around the same time they had the Federal Writers Project, they had this, I know probably no one here has probably heard of the South Carolina Negro Writers Project. Have you heard? Now, if you hadn't heard about this, that says a lot. Because you see, that was a group of writers, including Augustus Ladson, who were sent across South Carolina to get the stories of black people, who their folk tales. But the head of the Federal Writers Project in South Carolina, they had stories about the Charleston Race Riot of 1919, which is in the book, by the way. Stories of recollections of the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion, which is also in the book, and other such stories. And Mabel Montgomery of the Federal Writers Project said, "Nah, this stuff is too hot to handle. We can't publish this stuff." But guess what they did? Instead of destroying it, they took it to the South Caroliniana Library at the University of South Carolina, which is still in the archives. And this is probably the first book that has some of those stories. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of a few of those stories. One involves a doctor in my birthplace of Spartanburg, South Carolina, by the name of Dr. John W. Sexton. And he had this story to say about himself. When he was 18, he decided to buy a mule and a buggy and settle down on the farm. Once while visiting his best girl, who was a student at Spelman Seminary and who had another suitor from Atlanta Baptist College, Dr. Sexton was embarrassed and angered when they laughed at his ungrammatical country language. As a result, he abandoned the idea of the mule and buggy and decided to complete his education. With what success was done, the foregoing sketch will show. And he let that story of his embarrassment over his country speech and how they laughed at him. Now today, if that happens to a young person, what would happen most times?
Hello.
They get depressed, right? They feel sorry for themselves. But he took that and went on to become a well-respected physician and writer in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And because I think that that would do a whole lot for the young people today, to let them to understand that just because people will laugh at and mock you today, you could do something that make them regret that they laughed and mocked you tomorrow. Right. So I made sure to include things like that in the book also, okay? So let's look at a few more. Now, then in 1945, there was J. Mason Brewer over at the Claflin University. And he had what was called the South Carolina Negro Folklore Project, where they went around interviewing black people again for their stories. And it was published in a book called Humorous Folktales of the South Carolina Negro. And one of the few copies that exist of that is over at the Avery. And I use that for some of the tales in the book. And here are a couple of really good ones along those lines. One of them told about a man named Joshua, who was in court in Greenville for making moonshine whiskey. And so when he came into the court, he's all nervous and everything, and the judge comes in, looks at his case, and so he says, "Well now, are you Joshua?" And Joshua says, "Yes, sir." And so he says, "Now, Joshua, are you the man that made the sun stand still in the Bible?" And Joshua says, "No, sir. I didn't make the sun stand still, but I sure made the moonshine last night." And the judge was so amused that he set him free. And another came from a guy they interviewed named Murray Holiday. Now, some of you know that in my last book, I wrote about how in 1895, 6 brave black men, Robert Smalls, the one who freed himself and his family from slavery, William J. Whipper, a black lawyer from Broad Street, Thomas Miller, the founding president of South Carolina State, James Wigg and Isaiah Reed, 2 black lawyers from Beaufort, South Carolina, and Robert Anderson, a black teacher from Georgetown. They all went to the State House in South Carolina to argue against Benjamin Ryan Tillman when he made the segregation laws in South Carolina, right? So there was a folk tale that was passed down of their heroic effort, where Murray Holiday told one of the interviewers for the South Carolina Negro Folklore Project that once upon a time in Columbia, Benjamin Tillman, the architect of segregation in South Carolina, was arguing against one of the black men who was pleading his case against segregation, and the black man was doing so well that Benjamin Tillman said, "Why, you dirty black rascal, I'll swallow you alive for that." And the black man looked at Benjamin Tillman and said, "Boss, if you do, you're going to have more brains in your belly than you do in your head." That speaks for itself. And so, along with all this, I took the stories of my elders and put some of them in the book. I had an aunt named Barbara Collier up in Spartanburg. And whenever I would see her, some of y'all might have familiar with the Mount Moriah Baptist Church up in Spartanburg. She lived in these apartments behind that. And whenever I would see her, she'd always tell me these fascinating family stories. And I would go to my car after I was done and write them down in my notebook. Okay, she passed back in 2019. But one of the really good ones she told was about how she and my mother went to, what? Okay. Wow, okay. Good to see y'all. Good to see y'all. That's my niece Tiffany over there. Y'all who follow my page, y'all hear me talk about the cute self every now and then. Well, there she is in person. Hello, Gerald. Can somebody please? Yeah, good to see y'all. Can somebody get me some seats, please? All right. Good to see y'all. Good to see y'all. I'm really honored to see the both. So anyway, she used to tell me that she and my mother went to what they call the Sweet Daddy Grace Church in Charleston, Spartanburg. Now, some of you of a certain age might remember Sweet Daddy Grace. He had real long hair, and he had fingernails going out to here, and he would baptize people with a fire hose in the streets. And they would have these big ceremonies where they beat the drums and they play the trombone and all of this, and people would dance in the streets. Yeah, he was a very popular preacher. He died around 1960. But anyway, according to my Aunt Barbara, she and my mother went to see the Sweet Daddy Grace's church, right? And in those days, if you were black and you were a Baptist or a Methodist, as most of us were, you had very conservative services, okay? You didn't see a whole lot of, in the Baptist and Methodist churches, people jumping up and down and clapping their hands and all this sort of thing, or guitars and drums and all that. You basically had, blessed be the tie that binds our hearts of Christian love. So, they said they went to Sweet Daddy Grace Church, and they were beating the tambourines, jumping up and down, playing the trombones, going, hallelujah, praise the Lord, and so on and so forth. And they would carry on so much that Aunt Barbara and my mother started to laugh at them. And so then the preacher and the ushers turned around and saw them laughing. So the ushers came toward where they were, and my mother and Aunt Barbara hightailed it out the church. And they're running down South Liberty Street, which is the main drag in Spartanburg. And all of a sudden, my granddaddy, Jesse Montgomery, who drove a cab, he's making his rounds. He sees Aunt Barbara and my mother running down the street. And he pulled up and said, what's the matter with y'all girls? What are y'all running from? And so they told him what happened. He says, well, that's what you get for laughing at those people's church services. That's what you get. So that goes to show you, the differences in religious services today, needless to say. So, but one of the most interesting and important things that I captured in the book were my dad's stories as well as his writings. You see, my father went to South Carolina State back in the 40s, and Franklin Roosevelt sent him his greetings, and he wound up fighting in Saipan in World War II. But even while he was at State, he wrote a lot of very interesting things in his journals, and one of his journals is my prized possessions. And these are some of the things that he said in his journal. Now, keep in mind, when he said this, he was like 20 and 21 years old. I see my way as birds their trackless way. I shall arrive. What time? What circuit first? I ask not. In some time, his good time, I shall arrive. He guides me in the bird, in his good time. Whenever people get enough sense to think that religion is a way of life, and art and beauty, and shall train the minds of the youth in the science of the art of religion, then the church shall have no fear of religion failing. The church will be a recreational center where people will go to work, to hear lectures, speeches, etc. He will go to church to be refreshed, renewed, and to get his spirit filled. And during World War II, he had to say this on Christmas 1943. Guardian shepherds hear the songs of peace, and sought the lowly shed where Christ was born. Where now can angels sing that war shall cease? Without such songs, our lives are left forlorn. For now the skies bear argosies of wrath that shake the trembling earth and the trackless sea, and modern vandals tread a flaming path to trample into dust all charity. If we shall walk with faith the Christ-like way and build a brotherhood of worldwide scope that finds God's face in every child today, where creed nor caste destroys man's cherub's hope, we shall be rid of war and racial hate, and love and justice then will rule the state. Wow. My dad wrote that. Yes, that's your great-grandfather, Tiffany. My dad wrote this on Christmas Day, 1943, while at South Carolina State at the age of 21. And fortunately, he left behind not only a whole lot of stories for me, but he left behind that journal, which I keep in his old briefcase to this day. So what is the point of all of this? The point is as follows. You see, folks, one of the things that I hope that this book inspires people to do, and by the way, there's a whole lot more than what I just told you, I might add, because the ending of this book, I think you'll find it's a pretty real cliffhanger. You'll find it very interesting. But the important thing is that your elders have basically lived lives that could almost always make an interesting book. So sit down with your elders, especially the wise elders, and write down their stories while they are still here. Because, in Africa they have a saying that an elder is never really dead until their names, their stories, and their exploits are all forgotten by those who are still alive. So keep these things alive by writing down their stories, treasuring their wisdom, so that when they're no longer here, you have them to guide your lives, and their wisdom and stories will not be lost forever to the graveyards that so many are today. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Now I'm going to take some questions, and hold on a second. Let me take care of this first.